members only beyond this point. The woman who had just walked 60 feet across polished granite in shoes that did not belong to her, carrying a duffel bag that had seen 3 continents and a canvas tote from a gas station in Lejeune, stopped walking. She did not step back. She did not argue. She simply stood at the velvet rope that divided the Alderton International Terminal's Admiral's Lounge from the rest of the concourse, and she let the man behind the podium look at her the way he was looking at her, which was the way a person looks at something that does not belong in a frame. She was 39 years old. Her coat was wrong for October, in the way that coats are wrong when they have been bought for function and never replaced. Her hair had been pulled into a knot sometime that morning, and several hours of travel had made their opinion known about it. She was pale in the specific way of someone who has been indoors under artificial light for 12 consecutive days. Not the pallor of rest, but its opposite, and there were shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of terminal fluorescence could soften. She looked, in the honest accounting of the room, like a woman who had taken a wrong turn looking for her gate. She said, "I have a seat on the 750 to Dulles. I'm told this lounge operates on access by ticket tier." The man behind the podium, whose name tag read Clifton, and whose jacket was the particular shade of navy that belongs to hospitality uniforms everywhere, told her again, with the added texture of patience that is not patience, that the lounge was members only. He said it in a voice calibrated to carry no further than the rope, because the lounge was visible behind him through a wall of glass, and the people sitting in it with their leather chairs and their complimentary scotch and their laptops open at leisurely angles were the kind of people who did not enjoy the evidence of their exclusions being made audible. There were 4 of them visible from the concourse side of the glass. A man in his 60s with silver cufflinks and a Financial Times folded to a particular page. A woman in a cream blazer who had not looked up from her phone in at least 3 minutes. A younger man with the posture of someone who has flown business class long enough that it no longer registers as anything. And, seated nearest the glass in a club chair angled slightly toward the door, a man in civilian clothes, late 60s, with the kind of stillness that is not relaxation. The stillness was the specific and absolute stillness of someone who had learned to be still at exactly the moment when everyone else in the room was moving. He was looking at the woman at the rope. He was looking at the inside of her left wrist, where her sleeve had ridden up half an inch, and where a small piece of metal on a fine chain had slipped forward from under her cuff and caught the light. He set his glass down. He set it down the way a person sets a glass down when they are no longer thinking about the glass. Before we go further, if you have ever walked into a room and been told, without a word about who you are or what you've done, that you simply don't belong there, drop "I know that room" in the comments and hit subscribe, because Celine's story starts right here, and what that man by the glass just recognized on her wrist is about to change every assumption in this lounge. Celine Marsh had arrived at Alderton International on a Thursday in October at 2:47 in the afternoon, which was 4 hours and 3 minutes after the connecting flight from Ramstein had landed at its origin airport, which was not Alderton, but Hartsfield, 72 miles away. The connection from Hartsfield to Alderton had been booked on a standby basis, because the direct routing had cost $411 more than she had decided was reasonable for a domestic leg she could negotiate around, and because she had grown up in the specific economy of a person who learned early that $400 is not an abstraction, but a number with consequences. She had been awake for 31 hours, not in the restless, fragmented way of bad sleep, but in the continuous, fully present way of someone who had been needed at intervals throughout the night, and who had learned, over the course of 2 decades, to exist productively in the space between exhaustion and function. She was not impaired. She was simply running on the particular fuel that the body manufactures when it has been asked to run past its ordinary reserves, often enough that the process becomes muscle memory. The duffel bag on her shoulder contained 2 changes of clothes, a toiletry kit assembled with the specificity of someone who has packed under time pressure enough times to have reduced it to a system, a laptop that was 7 years old, and had been replaced twice in the organizational sense and never in the physical sense because she had declined both upgrades, a manila folder containing 3 sets of documents, and a paperback whose spine had been broken at page 212 and had not been opened since. The canvas tote from the Lejeune gas station contained a granola bar, a bottle of water, a small framed photograph wrapped in a sweatshirt, and a phone charger coiled around itself with the kind of precision that looks like habit but is actually a very old discipline. She had not eaten since 6:15 that morning, when she had taken a cup of coffee and a piece of toast in a cafeteria on the far side of an installation that does not appear in civilian directories, and she had eaten the toast standing up because the cafeteria chair she had pulled out had already belonged, implicitly, to someone else's ongoing conversation. The 7:50 to Dulles was the 3rd flight she had attempted to board in the past 18 hours. The first 2 had gone to people ahead of her on the standby list. She had not complained. She had moved to the end of the list, found a chair near an outlet, and waited. And the particular quality of her waiting was the quality of someone who has learned that the interval between what you need and what arrives is not empty time, but occupied time, and that the discipline is in what you do with the occupation. She had not planned on the lounge. She had walked past it because it was on the way to Gate 31, and she had slowed in front of it the way anyone slows in front of warmth when they are tired, and she had read the placard beside the velvet rope and concluded that her ticket tier, which was whatever standby passengers without frequent flyer status occupy on an airline's hierarchy, probably placed her below the threshold. She had gone to the podium anyway, because she had learned long ago that the placard and the actual rule are sometimes different things, and because the worst anyone can tell you is no, and no is a door, not a wall. She was at the door now. Clifton was giving her no for the 3rd time, and his voice had acquired the particular texture that service workers sometimes develop after a long shift, the texture that is not rudeness, but is indistinguishable from it when you are standing on the wrong side of the rope, 31 hours awake, $411 economized, with a framed photograph wrapped in a sweatshirt in a gas station tote bag because you did not have a proper case for it, and it mattered too much to pack without wrapping. The man in the club chair nearest the glass had not moved since he set down his glass. He was watching the specific small piece of metal on Celine's left wrist catch and lose the light as she shifted the duffel on her shoulder, and his expression was not pity, and it was not recognition in the social sense, but it was the expression of a man who has just read a sentence he did not expect to find in this particular book. His name was Hale, 4 stars, retired, Army. He had been sitting in this lounge for 40 minutes, waiting for a delayed connection to Colorado Springs, reading a brief he had already read 3 times, and until 60 seconds ago, the most significant thing that had happened was that the ice in his water had melted past the point of usefulness. He was on his feet before he had made a decision to stand. The glass wall of the lounge was behind him, and the velvet rope was 8 feet ahead, and between those 2 points, the geometry of the situation resolved itself without hurry, the way problems resolve when the person doing the resolving has 37 years of practice, reducing complex variables to their simplest moving parts. He reached the rope exactly as Clifton was drawing breath for a 4th iteration of the refusal. He said, "She's with me." That was all. Clifton looked at the man who had appeared at the rope from the inside of the lounge and made the rapid calculation that hospitality workers make when a member of sufficient standing speaks with sufficient certainty, and the calculation took approximately 3 seconds, and at the end of 3 seconds, he unclipped the rope. Celine turned her head and looked at the man standing just inside the threshold of the lounge, and her expression did not change in any way that a stranger could have read. But her right hand, which had been holding the strap of the duffel, dropped slightly, and her chin came up by about 2 degrees, and if you had spent any time at all in the kind of rooms she had spent time in over the past 2 decades, you would have recognized that 2 degrees, as the involuntary adjustment a person makes when they are in the presence of rank, even if the rank is no longer worn, and even if they themselves no longer hold a title. The people inside the glass lounge had returned to their laptops and their scotch and their phones because the event had resolved without drama and therefore offered nothing further to observe. Nobody in the lounge except Hale had the faintest idea what the small piece of metal on Celine's wrist meant. He did. He had seen it once before, on a wrist much like hers, and that wrist had belonged to a man who was no longer alive, and the specific and particular shape of that metal was the reason Hale had been sitting in this lounge for 40 minutes, looking at a brief he had already read 3 times, rather than reading anything new. He stepped back from the rope to let her through. She walked past him without looking at his face again, and he watched her choose a chair against the far wall, the chair farthest from the glass, the chair with sightlines to both the entrance and the concourse beyond, and he watched her lower the duffel to the floor on her left side and place the canvas tote on her right, and lean back with the careful and deliberate quality of someone who has been upright for a very long time. Clifton had reclipped the rope. The lounge held its temperature. Outside the glass, the concourse moved with the ordinary traffic of a Thursday afternoon, and nobody out there knew that anything had happened at all. But something had. The man with silver cufflinks glanced up once from his Financial Times and then returned to it, because whatever had just occurred near the velvet rope had not risen to the level of interest. The woman in the cream blazer had not looked up at all. The younger man with the relaxed posture turned a page on his laptop. Hale walked back to the club chair nearest the glass and sat down, but he did not pick up the brief. He was looking at the chair against the far wall, where Celine had closed her eyes, and where the small piece of metal on her left wrist was now lying flat against her skin, catching no light, visible only to someone who knew it was there and what it weighed. He had not spoken to her since those 3 words at the rope. She had not spoken to him at all. The ice in his water had completed its dissolution. He needed to know whether she knew. If you have ever been carrying something for someone who was gone, something nobody else in the room could see, drop "I know that room" in the comments right now. Because what Celine is carrying on her wrist is not just metal, it is a name. And that name is the reason why a 4-star general, retired, on his way to Colorado Springs for what his calendar described as a personal appointment, sat in an airport lounge for 40 minutes, reading a brief he had already read 3 times, and why, when he finally saw what was on her wrist, the brief went face down on the side table and stayed there. The piece of metal was a dog tag, not a replica, not a tribute piece sold at a military supply store, not a fashion item shaped like one. It was an actual government-issued aluminum identification tag, the kind stamped with name and blood type and faith preference in the specific sans serif typeface that the Department of Defense has used for longer than Celine had been alive, worn on a chain fine enough that it read, from any distance greater than 2 feet, as a pendant rather than an identifier. She wore it on the inside of her left wrist rather than around her neck, because she had worn it around her neck for 6 years and had stopped, not because the grief had stopped, but because she had decided that grief worn at the throat is a different kind of carrying than grief worn at the pulse point, and she was not sure which one was right, but she had chosen, and she had kept the choice. The name stamped into the tag was Marcus Ellery Marsh, her brother. He had been 26 years old and a first lieutenant in the Army Infantry when he died in Paktika Province, in a circumstance that military investigations had called complex, and that Celine, who had by then been in the Navy for 9 years and who had read the full report 3 times and the supplementary findings twice, called preventable. She had been in Bahrain when she found out. Her commanding officer had come to her workstation and sat down in the chair across from her and said her name once, and she had known from the single syllable what was coming, because that is the specific and particular quality of the way a superior sits down when the news is of that kind, the quality of weight, distributed with intention, of a person who is preparing to hold something with you. She had not cried in Bahrain. She had asked 2 questions, both of which were procedural, and then she had gone back to her workstation and finished the report she had been writing, because the report was due, and because finishing it was the only action available to her that had any edges, and she had learned long ago that when everything inside is formless, the thing to do is to find an edge and hold it. She had cried on a tarmac in Rota, Spain, 8 days later, alone on the flight line in the 40-minute window between an aircraft arriving and the next personnel rotation, standing in the particular dark that is not darkness but the light-colored shadow of a hangar, and she had cried in the specific, silent, total way of a person who has been holding it for 8 days with both hands and has finally let go. Then she had stopped and gone inside, and she had not cried about Marcus in the way of losing him since. She carried him at her wrist instead. She had left the Navy not in anger and not in failure, but in the ordinary and undramatic way that careers end when the work that gave them meaning has shifted to a form that no longer fits the person doing it. She had served 19 years and 5 months, which was 7 months short of the full 20 that would have secured a different grade of retirement benefit, and she had made the calculation and accepted the differential because the calculation was not about the benefit. The man who ran the team she had last led, a commander named Briggs who had a habit of saying her name in a tone that suggested he was conferring a small honor, had told her on her last day that she was making a mistake she would regret inside of a year. She had thanked him for his time and carried her box to the parking lot and driven to the highway and merged into traffic without looking back, because looking back is a habit, and she had always been careful about habits. For 14 months, she had been doing contract work for a non-governmental medical organization that trained local health workers in conflict-adjacent zones, work that used a different set of the skills she had accumulated and paid considerably less and felt, on most days, like exactly the right thing to be doing. The 3 days she had just spent on the installation, whose name was not in civilian directories, had been a consultation, paid and bounded, the kind of thing that former practitioners do when institutions need someone who knows where specific bodies of knowledge are kept and is willing to share the address without keeping the key. She had said what she knew, signed what needed signing, and departed on the next available transport, which had taken her to Hartsfield and then to Alderton, and eventually to a velvet rope, and then to this chair. She was tired in the precise and structural way of someone who needed 8 hours of sleep and would accept 4 if 4 was what the schedule offered, and she had closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to stop processing the visual field of the lounge, which required no response from her and was therefore a drain without a return. Hale watched her from the club chair by the glass. He was 68 years old, and he had been retired for 2 years and 11 months, which he had spent in a house in Colorado Springs that was considerably quieter than anywhere he had lived in the 37 years preceding it. He was on his way back to that house now for a reason that was not a personal appointment in the calendar sense, but was personal in the only sense that matters, which is the sense in which something has been left undone long enough that the leaving has become its own kind of presence. He had known Marcus Ellery Marsh. That was the thing. That was the sentence he had been turning over for the 40 minutes before Celine arrived at the rope, and it was the sentence he was still turning over now, reading it for the weight of its second half, the past tense of known. He had known Marcus for 3 years, had overseen the unit in the period that overlapped with Marcus's last deployment, had signed the correspondence that came after, and had been carrying for 2 years and 11 months a piece of information that the formal investigation had not surfaced, and that he had not known until after his retirement who to give it to. There had been a witness. Not a witness to the event itself, but a witness to the 48 hours preceding it. A soldier who had given a statement to Hale privately and off the record because the soldier had been afraid of what the record would do to him, and Hale had held the statement because the formal process had concluded and because he had not known, at the time, where Marcus's people were. He had not known about a sister. He had found out 7 weeks ago through a chain of contacts that began with a retired judge advocate in Virginia and ended with a name, Celine Marsh, and an organization, and a general category of location, And then 6 days ago, through the NGO's administrative office, a travel itinerary, and the name of an airport. He had booked the connection through Alderton on a 1 in 4 chance that she would be on the standby list he had been told she was on, and he had been sitting by the glass waiting, and then she had appeared at the rope, and he had seen the tag on her wrist, and the specific and absolute quality of certainty that comes from 37 years of training had settled over him like temperature. She was here. The information was here, in the breast pocket of his jacket, folded to a quarter of its original size, and it had been there for 2 years and 11 months, and it was going to leave his possession today. He stood up from the club chair for the second time in the past 20 minutes and walked across the lounge toward the chair against the far wall. Celine heard him coming. She had been tracking the acoustic footfall of every person in the room without deciding to, because that too was a habit, and she had already categorized his gait as deliberate and unhurried and aimed in her direction before he had crossed half the distance. She did not open her eyes until he was 3 feet away. When she did open them, he was standing with the particular stillness she had noticed through the glass, and he was looking at the tag on her wrist, and then he looked at her face. She looked back at him. There was a 4 count of silence. He said, "Your brother served in the 201st. It was not a question." She said, "He did." Hale sat down in the chair to her left, not the chair directly facing her, but the chair at an angle, the way you sit when you are not there to confront someone, but to sit beside them, and he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and removed the folded paper and held it in both hands in his lap without opening it. "I've been looking for you for 7 weeks," he said. Celine's right hand, which had been resting on the arm of the chair, was still. She looked at the folded paper and then at his face. "I knew Marcus," Hale said. "Not well. Well enough to know that what the report said was the whole story was not the whole story." The lounge was conducting its ordinary business around them. The man with the silver cufflinks ordered another drink. The woman in the cream blazer had finally looked up from her phone and was looking at her reflection in the dark of her laptop screen instead. Celine did not respond. She was doing what she always did in the interval between receiving information and deciding what to do with it, which was to hold it without yet touching it, the way you hold an object in the dark to understand its shape before you look at it. "There was a soldier who was with Marcus the day before," Hale said. "He gave me a statement. He was afraid to give it formally. He's out of the service now, and he's not afraid anymore. And 2 weeks ago, he agreed to give that statement to the Judge Advocate's review office." He held out the folded paper. "This is a copy of what he said. I was going to mail it, and then I found out you were passing through Alderton today." Celine looked at the paper for a moment that was neither short nor long. She took it. She did not open it. She held it in both hands the way he had held it, and her jaw tightened once and then released, and she said, in a voice that was not unsteady but was very quiet, "Did you know what they got wrong?" "Yes," Hale said. "Since when?" "Since the day I signed the closeout correspondence." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and temperature. She said, "You're telling me there was a statement that could have changed the finding, and you held it. A private statement, given to me by a frightened 22-year-old who would have been destroyed by what the process would have done to him. I made a judgment call." He paused. "I have been living with that judgment call for 2 years and 11 months. Celine looked at the folded paper in her hands. She said nothing. He said, "I'm not asking you to think well of the decision. I'm asking you to have the information." Something settled in her face that was not forgiveness, and was not its absence, but was the specific and particular expression of a person who has been waiting a long time for a question to have an answer, and has just been told that the answer exists, and is now adjusting to the weight of that. She set the paper down on the arm of the chair. "Marcus used to say," she said, and then she stopped, and started again, in a different register. "He used to say that the report is never the event. He said it made him crazy that people confuse them." She picked up the paper and put it in the breast pocket of her own jacket. "I'll read it when I'm alone," she said. Hale nodded. They sat together in the club chairs against the far wall of the lounge for another 43 minutes, until the departure board changed for his flight to Colorado Springs, and she rose with him, and they stood in the lounge for a moment before he went toward the gate. He said, "There was a review board request attached. It's still inside the paper. It needs your signature to proceed. No obligation." She said, "I know." He held out his hand. She shook it. The quality of the handshake was the quality of two people who are not meeting for the first time in the way that strangers meet, but for the first time in the way that people meet who have already been connected by something they did not choose. He went toward the gate. She sat back down in the chair against the far wall. It was quiet in the lounge. Outside the glass, the concourse moved in its ordinary Thursday way, with its rolling luggage and its coffee cups and its people going in their particular directions, and none of them knew anything about Marcus Ellery Marsh or about the woman sitting against the far wall of the Admiral's Lounge with a folded piece of paper in her breast pocket and a tag on her wrist that was catching no light at all. She put her hand over the pocket. She kept it there for a little while. The 7:50 to Dulles boarded at 7:19. The gate agent announced it over the concourse speakers at 7:03, and Celine heard it from the chair she had not left in the past hour and 20 minutes, and she gathered her duffel and her canvas tote and stood up and rolled her neck once and settled the duffel on her shoulder. She was crossing the lounge toward the exit when the older man with the silver cufflinks stepped in front of her, not deliberately blocking her path, but placing himself in it, in the way that people place themselves in paths when they have something to deliver and have not thought carefully about the geometry of delivery. He said, in a voice that was still pitched to Carrie, "I have to say, I watched that whole performance earlier, with the rope, and I thought it was very unbecoming of you to make that sort of scene." Celine stopped walking. The woman in the cream blazer, who was now near the bar, went still. The younger man with the relaxed posture looked up from his laptop. Clifton, visible through the glass at his podium, was not looking in, but the couple who had arrived at the rope in the past few minutes were, and the gate agent for the adjacent lounge desk had turned fractionally in the direction of the sound. The man was 63 years old, and his name was probably on a building somewhere, and he had the particular quality of certainty that settles permanently into people who have been told yes for so long that yes has become the texture of the air they breathe. And he said it again, the word unbecoming, as if the repetition would locate the problem more precisely. Celine said nothing for a count of 3. Then she said, "I didn't make a scene. You held up the line. There were people behind you." There had been no people behind her. The lounge had been at partial capacity, and the rope had seen no traffic in the relevant window. She did not say this. She said, "Excuse me, I have a flight." She walked past him. He said, "You're welcome, by the way, for the charity." She stopped. There was a moment. She turned around very slowly, with the unhurried quality of someone who has conducted difficult conversations in rooms with considerably higher stakes than this one, and she looked at him from a distance of about 4 feet, and her voice when she spoke was level and did not rise and did not sharpen. She said, "The general let me through as a colleague, not as a charity." The man opened his mouth. She said, "He recognized my brother's tag. That's all." She did not wait for the next sentence. She turned again and walked to the rope, and Clifton unclipped it without being asked, because he had heard everything, and his face was carrying a specific and careful neutrality that was doing a great deal of work. She walked through. The woman in the cream blazer had not looked away. The younger man with the relaxed posture had closed the laptop. The older man with the silver cufflinks was still standing in the middle of the lounge, and the thing that had been certainty in his expression had been replaced by something that is the precursor to understanding, which is the first moment when a person begins to suspect that the map they have been using does not match the territory. He had not known. He had not known about the tag, or the name on the tag, or what it cost to be the person who wore it. He had seen a tired woman at a rope in the wrong coat, with the wrong luggage, and he had read the visible facts of her, and produced a conclusion, and the conclusion had been wrong in all the ways that matter, and he was going to have to live inside that wrong conclusion for some time. The lounge returned to its temperature. Celine was already at gate 31. She had 31 minutes until boarding. She found an outlet and plugged in her phone and sat down in the hard plastic of the gate chair and reached into her breast pocket and took out the folded paper, and she held it in her hands for a moment, and then she opened it. It took 11 minutes. When she finished, she folded it again along its original lines and put it back in her pocket and pressed her hand flat against the outside of the pocket for a moment, and then she took out her phone. She found the number for the Judge Advocate's review office. She did not call it. She saved it under a name, which was Marcus, and she put the phone back in her pocket next to the paper. She was not going to sign anything tonight. She was going to sleep for 4 hours in Dulles and look at the paper again in the morning and make a decision with the particular care that she gave to decisions that could not be unmade, which was the same care she had given to every consequential decision in her adult life, which was neither slowness nor hesitation, but the specific precision of someone who has learned that the quality of the question determines the quality of the answer. The boarding announcement came at 7:17. She gathered the duffel and the tote and stood in line where the line formed, not at the front, which she had not been invited to, and which she did not seek, and she waited her turn and presented her boarding pass and walked down the jetway and found her seat, which was 31B, middle seat, and she put the duffel in the overhead and the tote under the seat and sat down and fastened the seat belt. The man in 31A was already asleep against the window. The woman in 31C arrived 4 minutes later and settled herself with considerable luggage activity, and when she finally sat down, she looked at Celine and apologized for the disruption, and Celine said it was fine, and it was. The plane pushed back at 7:52. She did not sleep. She watched the dark of the tarmac and the lit shapes of other aircraft in the line and the particular orange of the terminal lights, and she let herself be tired without resisting it, which was a skill that had taken years, and she held her left wrist in her right hand, with 2 fingers resting on the tag, and she thought about Marcus, not in the diffuse and painful way, but in the specific and clear way, the way of a particular memory with edges. She thought about the day he had called her from a payphone at Fort Benning because his cell battery was dead, and he had a 30-minute window, and she had been in the middle of a shift briefing, but she had stepped out of the room and taken the call and stood in the hallway for 27 minutes while he told her about a sergeant in his unit who had read the wrong map 3 times in a row and still been promoted, and Marcus had been unable to decide if this was a tragedy or a comedy, and Celine had told him it was the oldest story in the institution and that he needed to make peace with it. He had said, "How do you make peace with stupid?" She had said, "You don't. You work around it, and you protect the people it's going to fall on." He had laughed. He had a specific and particular laugh, Marcus, low and quick, and followed immediately by a look of surprise at himself, as if he found his own amusement slightly improbable, and she had heard it down the payphone line from Fort Benning and stored it without knowing she was storing it. She had been storing it for 8 years now. The plane reached its cruising altitude, and the cabin lights dimmed, and the flight attendant made her passage with the cart, and Celine took a cup of water and held it and looked at the small dark square of the window and the dimmer dark beyond it, which was the American South at night, from 37,000 feet, lit in the irregular, scattered way of things that are numerous but not continuous. She thought about the statement in her pocket. The soldier who had given it was named Crandall, and he had been a specialist, 22, from a town in western Oklahoma, and what he had witnessed in the 48 hours before Marcus died was a sequence of decisions made by a person with authority, who had been told something was fine when it was not fine, and had passed that assessment up the chain without verification, and the chain had acted on it, and Marcus had been where the chain decided he should be, which was the wrong place. Crandall had said in his statement that he had tried to raise the discrepancy through his own sergeant and had been told to focus on his job. He had focused on his job. He had been 22. Celine did not blame Crandall. She held this thought and examined it for the particular kind of dishonesty that can disguise itself as fairness. And she found the thought to be true. She did not blame him. He had been young and afraid, and he had done what young and afraid people do, which is to trust the structure over their own read of the ground, and the structure had failed him as thoroughly as it had failed Marcus. She did blame the person who had told the chain that it was fine. That person was named in the statement. The name was not in the original report. She pressed her hand against the pocket. She thought about signing the review request. She thought about the institutional timeline involved, which was long and complex and procedurally uncertain, and which would produce, at best, a revised finding and a formal acknowledgement, and which would not produce Marcus, and which would not produce the 27 minutes on the hallway payphone or the laugh that surprised him. She thought about it anyway. She thought about Marcus saying, "The report is never the event," and she thought about how a revised report was not the event either, but it was closer to it than the wrong one, and that the distance between the wrong one and the closer one was where Marcus actually was, in the record, in the institution, in the thing that remained after everything else had gone, and she thought that maybe the distance mattered. She had not made a decision by the time the plane began its descent into Dulles, but she had made a question. A good one. The review board request was filed 11 days after Celine landed at Dulles. She signed it on a Tuesday morning at a table in a coffee shop, 3 blocks from the NGO's Washington office, with a pen borrowed from the barista, and she mailed it from the post office on the corner at 11:47 in the morning, and she stood at the mailbox for a moment after dropping it in, and then she walked back to the coffee shop and finished her coffee. The review board convened 4 months and 12 days later. The findings were issued at the 7-month mark. The original closeout assessment was amended in 3 specific and consequential ways. The person whose name appeared in Crandall's statement was formally censured by the review and, at the conclusion of a separate administrative process, separated from the reserve affiliation they had maintained since leaving active duty. Celine was not present for any of the formal proceedings. She had submitted a written statement, 11 pages, which the board characterized in its summary as precise and without exaggeration, and which she had written in 4 sittings at the kitchen table of the apartment in the part of Virginia where she had rented rooms since coming back. She received the final board findings by mail. The letter arrived on a Thursday in May, which was 8 months and 4 days after the afternoon in the Admiral's Lounge, and she read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while she was reading, and when she finished, she sat with it for a while. The amended findings stated, in the specific and non-emotive language of formal military review, that the original closeout assessment had been based on incomplete information and that the circumstances of First Lieutenant Marcus Ellery Marsh's death were more accurately characterized by the revised language, which occupied 2 paragraphs on page 4. She read those 2 paragraphs 4 times. Then she folded the letter and put it with the other paper, the statement Hale had carried for 2 years and 11 months, and she put both papers in the back of the manila folder that had come with her from the installation and had been sitting on the kitchen shelf since October. She went outside. It was May, and the light was long, and the street was doing the ordinary things that streets do in the early evening, with the dogs and the children, and the neighbors, and the ambient sound of a city that does not know anything about the specific contents of specific kitchen shelves. She walked for a while. She did not have a destination. She walked the way you walk, when the thing you have been holding has been set down, and your hands are still registering the shape of it. She called Hale that evening. He answered on the 2nd ring. She told him about the amended finding. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he was glad, and she said that she was too, and they talked for 11 minutes about other things, about the NGO's current deployment, and the elevation of Colorado Springs in winter, and a book they had both apparently read in the same month, without knowing the other one was reading it. Before she hung up, she said, "There's going to be a training facility named for him. The organization I work with is opening a new site. I asked if they'd consider it. Hale said, "What did they say?" She said, "They said yes." He said, "That's right." There was a pause. She said, "Thank you for finding me." He said, "It took me too long." She said, "You found me." That was the whole of it. The facility opened 9 months after that, on a Wednesday in February, in a province adjacent to where the work was being done, a low building of the kind that is built to be functional and repaired and expanded as resources allow, with a hand-painted sign on the exterior wall that read Marcus Ellery Marsh Training Center in the local script and in English, and with a smaller plate mounted beside the door that gave his dates and his rank and the single word instructor in the informal sense, which was the word the program's Kenyan coordinator had suggested because she said it was the word that lasted. Celine flew in for the opening and flew out the next morning. She stood in front of the plate beside the door for a few minutes while the ceremony was going on inside, in the particular light of a February morning in that latitude, which is flat and clear and comes at a low angle, and she put her hand on the plate for a moment, and then she went inside. 3 months after the opening, a new field trainer joined the program. She was 26, just out of the Peace Corps, with no military background and no particular knowledge of what the facility was named for or who had named it. She had been there 9 days when she asked Celine, over a meal in the common room, whether it was true that Celine had served. Celine said yes. The trainer said she had heard something about a thing at an airport, a general, a lounge. She had heard it from someone at the Washington office, who had heard it from someone else. She asked whether it was true. Celine was quiet for a moment. She looked at the tag on her left wrist. She said, "A man let me through a door. That's the story." The trainer waited. Celine said, "He was carrying something that belonged to me. He'd been trying to find me for 7 weeks." She put down her fork. She said, "The rest of it was just a door." If this story reminded you of someone who came home carrying more than anyone could see, drop "I know that room" in the comments. And we tell these stories because they deserve to be told, and because the people who carried them quietly deserve to be heard. Subscribe if you want more stories about the ones who did the work and never asked for the credit. There are more of them than you know.